So first of all, for all of you who are here, but also for those of you who are watching by streaming video, I want to welcome you to this panel on perspectives and update on China. By the way, I will introduce our two panelists here, but I want to say that it's not that common for us to have a repeat panel. But this panel, particular panel, last year was so popular that we thought we would, bring the panel back. Also, I think I can say with a great deal of confidence that a lot has happened in the last year. So, so what they'll talk about, obviously, a lot has changed in the year since our last conference. So anything they say now will certainly be a new perspective on what has developed. First of all, I want to just introduce our two panelists. Anla Cheng has had a long history involved in investing in China. She was part of a partnership that invests in some very successful companies in China, and then she at the same time started SupChina a number of years ago, which is without question the leading information company, media company related to China. I encourage you to visit their website, which is has news stories and etc. But also they have newsletters and publications that I think you can find quite valuable. They also do have consulting services, so forth, that they provide as part of what they do. So Anla is the CEO and founder of the company. Jeremy is the editor-in-chief and not only writes many of the articles that you have access to, but he also is one of they have a podcast series which is really excellent, where they interview people, leading people on different topics. And I encourage you to, one, visit their website. Two, if you need some problems that that intersect with their area of expertise, use them. But certainly, sign up for their newsletters and publications and their podcasts. So with that,
thank you, Peter.
With that, what I want to do is we talked about what we wanted to cover. And I think what we decided was that we would try to cover things that are not necessarily always on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. In other words, things that they know quite well, that are not necessarily covered extensively, but also are very relevant to the kinds of decisions that all of you have to make. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through four questions. One is, what is happening inside of China that really matters, whether it's political, industry structure changes, government policies, etc., because it's not so obvious to people on the outside. Second, what are the attitudes between the U.S. and China and internally in China? Because we certainly are quite familiar with how the U.S. views China, but it's not as clear to outsiders how the Chinese view the U.S., but also what the internal attitude is inside of China. And the third is, what are the implications of all these factors for non-Chinese companies? And we're really going to split it into three categories. One is, what are the implications if you're operating or investing in China? Second, what does it mean if you're competing with Chinese companies? You may not be in China, but you're competing with Chinese companies. And third, what does it mean competing in outside of China? And then the third is, what if you're an exporter into China? So what are all of these changes, what the implications are for those? And last, we'll give a little update on the trade spat with the U.S. and their view of what's currently happening and what we can expect. We put that last because that's reported on pretty widely, but of course they have an interesting point of view. So let's start, and I guess the first one is, what's happening in China that really matters? And we have political, economic, industry structures. Maybe you can start wherever you wish. and whoever wants to start.
You go ahead first.
Okay, so politically, we're really seeing a continuation of what we've seen previously under Xi Jinping, which is that the party rule is being centralized even further. They just completed the fourth plenary session of the 19th Congress of the Communist Party. The meeting took place a little later than it typically does, and there was a lot of speculation about why, and as usual, none of that speculation actually meant anything. There was only one new piece of rhetoric in the document that they published afterward, and that was about Hong Kong, saying that the security situation of Hong Kong has to be dealt with, but giving no details on that. So I think politically, we're looking at more Xi Jinping. He continues to centralize power in his own hands. He continues to emphasize ideology and loyalty to the Communist Party. And this is going on at the same time as a renewed emphasis on getting rid of Western political influences at universities and within the body politic, essentially. So I guess that's the one of the big political trends, which is certainly not new, but it has continued.
If I may add on that point before you get on, but he knows much more than I do because he's the editor-in-chief and I do admin. I do look at what's going on in China. So just to add to Jeremy's points, what's going on within China and what they're focused on are three things: poverty alleviation, urbanization, and national security. So those are the three things that Xi Jinping really cares about. So what that means is poverty alleviation. They still have 150 million people making less than $5 a day. And you hear about the billionaires, there are 850 of them there, 550 of them here, but there are a lot of people who are very, very poor, which is why GDP per capita in China is only 10,000 plus, which is close to Dominican Republic and Costa Rica, whereas the US GDP per capita is about 65,000.
And they have extensive programs actually
to lift them.
Explicitly to lift people out of poverty, right?
Well,
and it is, you're right, I mean, it's something that Xi Jinping has emphasized pretty much from day one as a major priority.
Right.
I have one question to ask you about the political thing. There are a lot of people that if you're outside of China, people tend to think of the Communist Party as one party and they speak with one voice and so forth. The reality is there are also factions within the Chinese Communist Party and government and big debates within. To what extent is that getting worse or not getting worse, and what are the implications? Particularly, I know in the trade area, there's huge amount of argument internally within China, the Chinese government, about which way to head and how much to give in and not give in, right? And that's influencing these negotiations, right?
Well, anybody who claims to know what Xi Jinping talks about with his senior advisors is lying. So we don't really know details about, the factional disputes that must be going on. But I think what is pretty clear in the last 2 years is that there is less and less room for any kind of dissenting opinion. The boss man doesn't want to hear anything different. And I think that, I think that's where the danger is in China right now. There is one other thing I think we should say, sort of almost a countervailing trend, which is one that I've been very hesitant to say is real, is financial opening. But it does seem that this year particularly, they've really started to put their money where their mouth is in terms of letting at least the financial industry in a way that just wasn't possible before. I would have to say you always have to have a huge caveat with China, because just because they mean you can open a company doesn't mean you'll actually be able to run the business or run it profitably. But that's new.
Right. So just want to elaborate on Jeremy's point, and that is correct that foreigners are now allowed to own up to 100% of the companies starting next year, which was 1 year earlier than they had expected. And one doesn't hear much about it, but already JP Morgan and Goldman, many of the...
Well, this is the financial community, right?
It's not only finance, it's insurance, including credit cards. Of course, now they delayed the credit card approvals for so long, and nobody uses credit card in China because WeChat and Alipay have taken over. But it's allowing quite a few industries.
How about the industrial side, though? Because obviously the audience here are people who are in the chemical industry. Is anything likely to get better in terms of either intellectual property protection or the ability, I know some companies have been able to, like BSF was able to 100% own a new facility, but what's happening there in terms of industrial ownership in TIP?
The official rhetoric hasn't mentioned non-financial opening, at least not in any very obvious way. The last year, all of the talk about opening to foreign businesses has been focused on the financial industry.
That's certainly part of the trade negotiation, right?
Yeah,
Right?
and I mean, I suspect that's also why you've seen some rather rapid action in the last year, is because there's a need to look as though you are doing something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I think there's some skepticism about how much progress and how, and the speed with which they'll make progress. I think outside the financial arena, right?
And I want to go back to the faction topic, because there are a lot of factions within China, and in fact, while Xi Jinping may project the allure of being a very strong man, but in fact others may criticize and say he's actually very insecure. And the thing is, whoever his contender might be, he's locked him up. Last I heard was 250, but now apparently 350,000 people have been locked up. So everybody that's his enemy or imaginable are in jail.
Well, lock them up seems to be a favorite phrase in the U.S. politics as well. So why not in China? Lock them up, right? On the economic side, there are all sorts of there's all sorts of reports about what's going on. The consensus definitely is that the economy is slowing. What's not so clear is how much, and can you rely on the government statistics or not. I think the two of you interact a lot with people in China. What's your sense? Is it a lot worse, or does it vary according to sector?
So it seems to be twofold. Some have said in Tianjin they're definitely in a recession. Last quarter, corporate profits were down 15 to 25%, but now the estimates of this quarter is going to be down like 1 or 2%. And things are actually picking up, and so overall this year, they may actually come in about a little bit about 6%. And so you wonder how does, you have to question whether the numbers are a little bit doctored up. But Fitch Ratings and many of the others, Moody's, etc., have all downgraded for next year to about 5.6 to about 5.9%. So the forecasts are definitely coming down. But having said that, the slowdown that we experienced in the last quarter, they're seeing a little pickup this quarter and then another slowdown towards.
So it's a little hard to tell.
A little hard to tell.
But
definitely slow down.
Yeah.
And especially because these factories have moved out. Vietnam is full, but much of the manufacturing has left China.
Yeah, that's right.
Jerry, maybe you
do you have a comment?
I don't know. I mean, part of my job is to read the financial press every day, and it's today the markets are up, tomorrow they're down. Oh, there's going to be a recession this year. Tomorrow there's not. Oh, the Chinese economy is some index of industrial production has gone up, and then the next day there's some job number that indicates the opposite. It's very difficult. But I mean, the talk is definitely gloomy. And the one sector that perhaps I have more exposure to than the other people in this room, where I've noticed it's very noticeable, is technology in China. There's a lot of talk of a tech winter, a venture capital winter. Some of it, I think, has to do with the fact that these hyper-growth companies that were perhaps not based completely on reality, like the Uber and WeWorks of the world, the Chinese equivalents, like Didi, they're slowing down because we've realized that their business model involves a fair bit of snake oil, and we haven't quite figured out how they're actually going to turn themselves around. So, I mean, some of it is the sort of hype of the sharing economy, I think, that is coming down. But it's not just that, because people at big tech companies are worried about layoffs, and companies like JD have laid people off. You know, they've closed down divisions. They're talking about having to approach the world in a different way than they had to in the last decade.
So a little bit
can I
of
just
the...
say a few more
yeah.
things on that point? It's very much in line with what's happened with Masayoshi Son's vision fund. You know, once he found out that his investments were not optimal, and you've seen the downgrading on WeWork, very much the same. There's a frothy element in the VC investment world in China. The amount that was invested into China VC by the US is equivalent to how much the Chinese invested. It's close to between 15 to 30 billion. Mm-hmm. It's a very big, really robust market with very frothy valuations. But what happened is that China has now just crossed in the last month more unicorns that were generated in China than the US this past year. Yeah. And they continue to try to IPO here because the terms here are much more favorable. You know, after you IPO, the lockup period is 90 days or 180 days, right. Versus in China it's 1 year or 3 years. Mm-hmm. The market value, you don't have to have as big a market value, whereas in China you need $14 billion equivalent. So China is trying to change those rules to keep those very attractive tech companies locally, so they don't have to come to NASDAQ or the US.
Yeah, and they've opened up new exchanges and so forth to
the
do that.
Star exchange in China.
So maybe some of the things that are happening to the Ubers and the WeWorks and so forth here are spreading a little bit in China, but not as much,
exactly.
Right? Yeah. Now, one other thing is within China, at least there have been a lot of reports that the Chinese government is favoring the state-owned enterprises and being less favorable towards the private, which is a bit sad in a sense because the private companies and the non-state-owned companies have been the most efficient and have created the most growth, and the state-owned have been the least efficient and so forth. Now, is that true, and what impact does it have for those people here who have involvement with China or have some kind of business relationship with Chinese companies?
Well, the first time that line of thinking became sort of common amongst the punditry, at least, was actually before Xi Jinping, when Hu Jintao was still the top guy. It was, I think, as long ago as about 2008, I first heard the word Guojin Mintui, which means the country advances and the people retreat, mm-hmm. which is a description of this phenomenon. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the state sector has the full support of the Communist Party, and that, despite some sort of bromides about reform at the beginning of his tenure, Xi is, he's an ideologically committed communist, and he is totally fine with the country owning the biggest companies. Mm-hmm. So my sense is that they're pragmatic enough that we're not seeing anything like an attempt at nationalization or anything drastic like that.
But they're favoring,
but on an ongoing basis,
which is unfortunate because the companies that have been most competitive have really been the private companies.
So all the ROI, ROE, ROA, the private companies have much higher returns than the state-owned enterprises. And not only that, unfortunately, the funding has gone to the state-owned enterprises, but they're realizing the private companies are the ones that provide 80% of the employment and create the wealth of China. Really comes from the private.
So they're really not favoring the real economic champions.
But they're recognizing that, and they want to make the changes. I mean, it's been a huge disappointment because that was all about reform when Xi Jinping came on a handful of years ago, that they thought this reform was really going to take place, and it didn't happen. Right now, the focus is on making sure that the smaller banks are reforming, and maybe Jeremy could talk a little bit more about that. But we've had a few bankruptcies in China, and
in fact, that was one of my next question. Like every year, people say, "Oh, the Chinese governments, the Chinese companies have a huge amount of debt, way more than even what is published and is known and so forth." There was an article recently in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal saying the same things, that when the state-owned banks, were a little stingier on lending to the local governments. They went out and borrowed anyway from other sources, right? So now this could be one of those things that every year everybody says it's going to collapse and it doesn't. But do you have any sense of that, or is it just really impossible to tell whether it will reach some, you know, some tipping point, right, in terms of debt, right?
I don't know, you know, people have, you're right, the tipping point, when is the tipping point, predicting the tipping point? I mean, I don't know if you're all familiar with a book called The Coming Collapse of China, written by Cheng in 1999, I think. He still continues just about every year to rehash his coming collapse theory, but it always gets pushed a few years down the road. And I feel a little bit like that about the sort of idea that one day China's just going to implode in this enormous ball of debt. Mm-hmm. Firstly, because the government has a lot of means at its disposal to you know, avoid a truly catastrophic event. I mean, if you own the companies and the banks and the local governments that owe each other the money, you have a few ways to sort this out, right? Yeah.
And they have a savings rate that up till recently was like 50%.
Yeah.
But the younger people now are spending much more and using their credit cards.
Maybe this is something in terms of like big things that are happening in China that I think people should be thinking about, which is this, that we are faced with the first generation of mainland Chinese who don't know how to save, and they spend like American kids. And they've
It's that bad, huh?
It's worse, I think. Yeah, it is that bad. They
They're
have
the
never...
ones that are buying the Hermes bags and the Gucci bags. And,
Right, yeah, just go to Fifth Avenue. And these kids have never known, not only hard times, they've never known a time when next year wasn't better than last year.
And not only that, they're not taught any of that revolutions in their textbooks. So they don't know about the Cultural Revolution or any of that.
So when I think about the coming possible collapse or end of the Chinese economic miracle, what I contemplate is, you know, what happens if you have a really serious slowdown for a year and you have, you know, 2-3 generations of young people who are not mentally equipped to deal with this. That's what I kind of worry about in the big picture.
So a lot of debt, but just really not clear when it may hit some crossing point.
Well, some have said that it's over 300%. You know, up till about a year ago it was 200 something, but it's now possibly over 300% of GDP.
Is debt?
Then debt, yes.
Yeah.
But their reserves are still ample because they still have a higher savings rate.
And the reality is that the government, certainly for state banks, they can just convert debt into equity, right?
And they put it off balance sheet.
Yeah, so that's a mechanism. So now the third real question, Hong Kong. What's going on now, and you know, what do you think is going to happen to the extent you have an opinion?
Okay. I mean, Anla, this is an interesting question because we've talked to different groups of people and had some fairly different responses, I think. I mean, I'm sorry to be the pessimist in this room. I'm pretty pessimistic about everything right now. But it seems to me that you have an immovable force meeting what is the saying? You have two forces that there doesn't seem to be any way that they will compromise.
There's no overlap between.
There's no overlap between
one is demanding and the other one's willing to give.
Yeah, and I think that the protesters either don't know or know that in some ways what they're doing is futile, but they're going to do it anyway. What I think is a serious problem in the Hong Kong government and in Beijing is a complete lack of a willingness to recognize that there are factors here aside from economic. So everything they propose is build affordable housing, you know, integrate Hong Kong with the Greater Bay Area, and so that, you know, the economic prosperity of Shenzhen flows over. They seem to think that this is it's Hong Kong is homo economicus and nothing else is going to get them off the streets. And I think they're really deeply, grievously wrong about that.
Well, certainly one of the big problems that created this is that the Chinese government followed a policy when they took over Hong Kong. They said, okay, if we just make the billionaires happy, then everything will be fine. And what happened though was that the creation of jobs wasn't fast enough. And the other is the billionaires who controlled all the real estate just built very expensive housing. And so the vast majority of the middle class, so forth, they basically difficult time because housing became so expensive. So you had a large group of people who basically weren't getting the new jobs, and they were getting squeezed economically. And I think the Chinese government just miscalculated. They didn't realize that, in fact, and right next door is Shenzhen, which is prospering, and right next door, and with better economics and so forth. So the contrast was a disaster for the people, for the Hong Kong citizens who were not billionaires, particularly the young people. So, but on the other hand, is this going to be another Tiananmen Square or not really?
Well, I just want to say that the profile of the protesters have changed radically, because in the beginning you had much larger numbers, 1 million to 2 million, and it was everybody from the parents to the grandparents, and they were bringing 5-year-old kids out on the street, and it was very peaceful and very organized. But now the radical group and a slightly younger group has remained, and now they've become very violent. And instead of asking for the 5 things, extradition, et cetera, now they're asking for democracy, which we know they're never going to get.
Right.
The other thing that I think a lot of people don't realize is that if you check the IQ, which countries rank the highest in IQ, Hong Kong ranks as number 1 or number 2. And what a waste of brain power, because Hong Kong people are so well educated and are so smart and so intelligent. To waste this time 6 months protesting, to me, is very, very personally sad.
It's hard to see what the ending is of all of this, right?
Yeah.
But the Chinese government can't afford to have another Tiananmen Square, but
They cannot.
what are you going to do?
I think they're going to carry on doing what they're doing.
And just wait it out.
Well, a bit more than wait it out. They're sending in thugs to beat people up and harass
That's what's
people,
happening now.
stab people. They seem to be, it's people from Hong Kong reporting that their mainlanders inserted in the police. They're going to make it difficult for companies. So you saw, Cathay Pacific having trouble, and the CEO having to resign essentially because of pressure from Beijing. And I think that's going to continue. Any company that has staff associated with protests, they're going to start finding life difficult in one way or another.
Well, then that's a natural segue to our second section of questions, which is the attitude section, right? The demonization of China in the U.S., China's view of the U.S., but also within China, what the attitudes are. And I think this is a special category because the two of you have some insights that are not so obvious to those of us who live here in the U.S. about what's happening there and then what the implications are. So, Anla?
Okay, I'll go first. So last year, when Pence spoke and made that speech October 4th at the Hudson Institute, that was a pivotal moment because that was the first time that he, quote-unquote, demonized China and said that they were being unfair, they weren't being equitable in trade, they were stealing. And at the time, it seemed very harsh. Now, a year later, that government-to-government talk has filtered down the demonization of China. Then it was business to business, and then we had this whole MBA incident recently with Daryl Morey and Shaquille O'Neal, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it. And now they're saying, now the people are saying that if you're an American company doing business with China, you've got to choose. Do you want the money, or you want to have ethics and vote for democracy? So it's gone from government, business, and now people to people. And it's not infrequent when you talk to an individual who doesn't know too much about America, let's say in the Midwest or maybe even Connecticut, they would say, oh,
Doesn't
China.
know too much about China.
Yeah, they would say, oh, China, they're so evil. They're bad people, bad country, and the demonization has become very rampant, and which is a very unfortunate thing because within China, Xi Jinping is the popularity, and Jeremy was pointing out to me that they really don't have an official poll, but about 90% of the people are very happy. They're happy with Xi Jinping, they're happy with the way the country went because now they have food, they have jobs, they have security, they have a future, their children have a future, and they're very happy. So there's a huge gap between how we see China, the average American, and how Chinese see China.
So how do the Chinese view the U.S.? The population but more importantly, the government, right? Because the government's view is critical for what a lot of these people do, which is operate in
I'll let
China.
Jeremy respond.
Well, I think the events of the last 18 months have convinced them with a great deal of reason that the United States wants to contain China's rise. I think that's the consensus view in Beijing now. And why wouldn't they believe that, honestly? It's not an illogical conclusion to draw from everything that's going on right now.
And at that Pence's speech, he cited, and somewhat, I wouldn't say wrongly, but he specifically said China has this Made in China 2025 program and strategy, which says 90% of the world components, etc., have to belong to China. And a little bit off the mark, but since then, China realized, all they were trying to say was, we missed out on the Industrial Revolution completely, because Mao was busy melting pots to make bullets and bombs. And we have been humiliated so much from World War I, World War II. Never again, we're going to not miss the next revolution, which is a technological revolution. And we want to be really good, not so much beat the world, but be really good at it. And so now, so many millions of students graduating each year in STEM, and they want to excel. So Made in China 2025 was a goal that they had for themselves, but really misunderstood by the West. And so they decided to keep quiet about it. It's never mentioned anymore, but they're still moving ahead with that internal plan.
Oh, even faster.
Maybe faster.
I'm sure, undoubtedly faster. If you're Huawei and you don't know when you're going to. Right now you can get some stuff from the United States, but that's only on by Trump's grace. You don't know when that will be cut off. You're going to be doing everything you can to be absolutely independent of America. And I think the lasting effect of the trade war and the sort of set of aggressive policies towards China has been, number one, the agricultural market is gone forever. American farmers can say goodbye to that market. They're never going to buy it in the same quantities that they used to. The other thing is that in technology, there's a new urgency to the quest for self-reliance.
Yeah, so ironically, and there are different opinions about this, but ironically, some of these actions may have accelerated the Chinese advancement, right? Huawei wouldn't need to develop a substitute for Android if it weren't for the fact that they were being blocked, right? So now they're accelerating that progress. So it could be a Pyrrhic victory, right? By excluding them from U.S. technology companies, selling to China. The sad thing about the humanization of China is it's really quite bipartisan, right? It's not just Republican.
The only bipartisan consensus in this country, the only thing that both parties agree on, literally.
And in some cases, from China's view, the Democrats are even worse because they still have human rights and affirmative action.
Right.
On top of everything else.
Yeah, which is really, unfortunate only in the sense it's too extreme, right? Right, relative to what the reality is. So if you...
I do feel I have to say that if we use the word demonization, Beijing isn't helping itself in recent years. When you run concentration camps for 1 million people in Xinjiang, as somebody, I correspond with people every day who give me a hard time about what we cover about China, either because we're too soft on Beijing or because we're, bashing them too much. It is very difficult to maintain a steady and cool view on China right now. There's a lot going on, and some of the things are very horrible.
Let's talk about the implications of all these things for non-Chinese companies, so for the people here in this room. So let's start with the first one, and that is, what are the challenges or the implications if you are operating in China, or you're thinking of operating in China. I know one place we could start is you were talking about the apology list, right? For example, as an example of the challenge that exists for companies operating in China.
So Jeremy and his team put together an incredible video that I hope you'll all watch. And we put together a list of all the companies around the world that have apologized to China for either forgetting to mention Taiwan, Tibet, or Mongolia, or having mentioned it, the wrong way, or whatever it is, you can't be right. So, they're constantly apologizing so they don't lose that $1 billion market.
And it's a long list.
It's a long list, about 30 of them.
Well, we haven't had to apologize yet.
Not yet,
No.
Peter.
I think chemical industry, though, perhaps you are lucky. Because, I mean, the apologies usually come from like a T-shirt from a fashion brand that lists Hong Kong in the same status as other countries, that kind of thing. Chemical industry isn't one that happens on Twitter, really, for which you're quite lucky.
Yeah.
You mean they don't sell polypropylene by social media?
Not as far as I know. Maybe
I'm just shocked. I can't believe how backward we are, right? So forth. So, but again, with all these changes, what do you think? If you were in the shoes of some of these CEOs here, and say what's all going on, what would you say were sort of the 4 or 5 most important implications of all these things? Good, bad, or just not good or bad, but what do you have to do, right?
Well, you're getting pressure on both sides, because Trump has said at one point a few months back that he wanted all U.S. companies to come out of China. And American companies to come out of China.
Right.
American companies in aggregate make about $375 billion in China.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very profitable operation. And so you have to keep that in mind. And then on the other hand, the Chinese, at least now in the financial insurance and credit cards, they're opening up, and they want to be the, at one point Bob Zoellick said, can China be the stakeholder? Can they become the world?
a responsible stakeholder.
Responsible stakeholder. I'm not sure if China can, but they want to be, and I guess two or 2.5 years ago at Davos, Xi Jinping said, we'd love to be a responsible stakeholder. And they're trying, but will they be? I think the jury's still out.
So
Jeremy, did you want to say something?
I mean, I would say prepare for economic uncertainty or even possibly gloom and doom in China. Despite all the financial opening, I think one has to be prepared for, if you're an American company, for troubles that you never had before.
so you're saying if you operate in China and you're a non-Chinese company, there may be more problems than benefits going forward?
I mean, I think, depends on the country that your company's headquartered in, but I think Canadian and American companies, in certain industries have already felt political punishment, for things their countries did. Not like these apologies. The apologies, we were just talking about our companies apologizing because they printed a T-shirt with the wrong thing about Hong Kong, or somebody tweeted something. This is a different kind of a problem.
Well, fortunately, the companies in this room don't produce branded consumer products, but definitely in that case, there's been some backlash in China against buying American brands, right? So I guess the fact that you sell polypropylene, but you don't put Louis Vuitton on it or something like that is probably a plus these days, right? But the challenges might be elsewhere.
I would say, I mean, you have to keep an eye on the government policies. That would be the most important thing, because I mean that can change overnight, and the chemical industry is one of the few industries where occasionally popular protests change it in China.
Oh, that's true.
Not insignificant number of plants like paraxylene, that kind of thing, have the local governments have actually been very tolerant of popular protests, NIMBY protests essentially.
Well, one of the things is, I listed in the question competing with Chinese companies, but the reality is one of the impacts of the tariffs is the Chinese actually lowered the tariffs from the EU and so forth.
Right, they're doing more business there.
And so actually, in many respects, there's increased competition from other Western chemical companies, etc., as a result of the lower tariffs. They're paying lower tariffs, and then we're paying higher tariffs, right? So it's not just competing with Chinese companies, it's the relative competitiveness because of all of the relative tariffs that are being levied, right?
I mean, that's a serious issue, I think, in all industries. I mean, if you look at what they're doing in agriculture now, China is very clearly going out and seeking other supplies. They've just, just in the last couple of weeks, they opened up China to Irish beef, which I think had been banned after mad cow disease some years ago.
Right.
They're in talks with the biggest meat packer in Russia to buy more Russian pork. Same with Brazil and soy. These are stuff they used to get from America, and they won't anymore. They'll get it from other countries.
Yeah, actually, in the news recently, Trump was complaining because he said, "Oh, I thought we had an agreement that you would buy 52 billion of soybeans, And the Chinese said, "Well, we didn't promise just to buy no matter what at any price. It's got to be economic." But then they purchased a huge amount from Brazil. So, but it's not clear it was because of this lower price or what. But that certainly made Trump mad, right? Because he just thought they'll just buy 52 billion, right? So it's interesting. So all of this leads to a lot of uncertainty, I think, for a lot of companies, whether they're operating in China, whether they're thinking investing in China, whether they're competing with Chinese companies, or exporting product into China, right? So any of those categories, it's become more difficult, I guess, right?
And I think this last tariff, that December 15th, if they go forward with that, and if phase 1 doesn't work out, it turns out that most of these companies actually are affecting multinational companies because they're the ones that are manufacturing it, and the assemblage is also done outside China, and so that particular tariffs is the one that least negatively affects China.
Yeah.
So we hope that phase 1 goes through very quickly, because without that, Trump really doesn't have much of a more bargaining power.
No more bargaining power, right. So the last question I want to ask before we open up to questions from the audience here in the room and also online, the trade situation. What's your take? What's your latest update on how you see the China-U.S. trade dispute, and also, what do you expect is going to happen?
Jeremy.
Okay, wow, yeah.
I know you've never been asked this question. Well, it's an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
In our office on July 6th last year, when the first tariffs went into effect, we said this is day 1 of the new world. And I don't see an end to the count we're keeping of days since July 6, 2018. I don't see how it's possible for either side to climb down right now. From what we can understand of what may be in the phase 1 agreement, all it is a cessation of hostilities. The US is no better, in fact it's worse off than it was before the tariff started. Nobody's got what they wanted. Many of the key US demands are simply politically unacceptable in China. And then of course the negotiator-in-chief is, a very erratic individual who I think is not suited to negotiate with Chinese people either, because, there's a limit to how much you should accommodate Chinese people, because Chinese culture is different, I think. In some ways business is business, negotiation and negotiate a price is a price. But on the other hand, there certainly is, the cultural fact of face in China is a real thing.
Yes.
And if you want to talk to the Chinese government, you can't be insulting them on Twitter, as they're going into the meeting. It just doesn't work that way. They'd rather, slit their wrists than talk to you after that. So I don't see, as long as Trump is in office, I don't really see how this can be resolved in a productive way. But I don't really see what's going to happen afterwards either. Of course that depends on who it is. We started a democratic presidential China tracker on our website, and the idea was we thought China's got to be an important part of the debate right now, right? It's aside from climate change, it's one of the things that everybody says this is the AI, climate change, and China. These are the three big issues that everybody's talking about. Not a single Democratic candidate has spent more than a couple of minutes on China. And generally what they're saying is China bad. Yes, we bash China too. I mean that's basically the
exactly that way.
Almost. So I'm equally worried about what happens afterwards, because there seems to be absolutely no coherence. The one candidate who was coherent, we actually managed to get one of our reporters, got him on video, and we published it last night, Andrew Young, who, he said something very sensible, which was that we have a lot of problems with China, but just, starting a new Cold War is an answer, which is, very sensible. But of course, Andrew Young isn't going to become the president of the United States. So.
Anla, do you have any?
Actually, Jeremy said it all.
Yeah.
Jeremy said it all. It's a very precarious.
I think the other factor, which we can't ignore, is that obviously the impeachment inquiry is going to have an effect, and that's obvious, right? So probably part of what the Chinese government's thinking is, let's see, it's about a year. It's a year before the next elections. We've got the impeachment inquiries, right? There might be some easing of the tariffs, or at least not putting on the increased tariffs. If we can live with the negative economic things that are happening in our economy for another year, maybe we have a different president. In the United States, the other part is that they are quite aware that to the extent that they give something to Trump, that Trump can declare, he declares both things victories, but declare legitimate victory, you just help him get reelected, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if, this is speculation, I would be surprised that the impeachment inquiry is a big effect on the trade negotiations. So if anything though, then it would reinforce your view that not much is going to happen, right? Because there may be some upside to see how the elections go in 2020, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But you just look at the noises coming out of the rooms. What kind of clowns negotiate in that way, where promises are made long before any signatures are on the contracts. Promises on both sides, promises that are assumed that the Chinese have made, that the Chinese have never said. This is just amateur hour. I don't think we talk enough about how amateurish this whole show is. Anyway.
So what I'd like to do is open it up to questions from the audience here, and also those of you who are online. There is a chat function, and if you have a question, you can just type it in, and Devin will be able to see the question and be able to read it to the audience and to our panelists. So let me start with the audience here. Carlos?
Yes, thank you. I have two questions. I have a curiosity question and a more of a geopolitical question. So the curiosity question is, are both of you granted visas to travel into China? And when you travel into China, can you travel freely? That's the curiosity part. The geopolitical side is, in this bipolar world, who are China's natural allies, and what is their attitude to who their friends are versus what you think they have defined as who their enemy is?
So for those, because they may not hear, for those of you online, I'll repeat it. One question is, do you have any concerns about traveling in China? And the other was, what are the geopolitical allies of China today, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we were talking about visas just before we walked in here, Jeremy and I. And I've been going to China since 1985, sometimes 7-8 times a year, and it's never occurred to me about having any issues. But I was in Hong Kong maybe 3.5 weeks ago, and that was about the time they had the 70th anniversary. And we were officially banned last year during Tiananmen Square, and where we had about 7,000 attackers on our cybersecurity issues. And when we came back on, we had a lot of emails and congratulatory remarks from ambassadors saying, you're now an official media site, so congratulations. So we felt, very encouraged, even though we were already down for a while. But this time was the first time I didn't want to go to China because this was their 70th anniversary, and they were displaying hypersonic missiles and showing the military strength, etc. And I've never had a problem, but when I do go to China, my phone and the laptop turns black. So I know that somebody's watching me, and this happens twice.
Well, they suck everything out.
They suck everything out. So I thought maybe I should be careful. So we've been thinking about that. Jeremy felt exactly the same.
Yeah, I mean, I lived in China for 20 years, and after I moved to the States, I'd go back 3-4 times a year. The last year or so, particularly the detention of the 2 Canadians, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but after the arrest on American request of the Huawei CFO, in Canada, China arrested on trumped-up charges 2 Canadians and is holding them on national security charges. And I have a lot of mutual friends with both of them, so it is somewhat concerning.
My own exposure to a lot of companies is that they're thinking very hard about whether their executives should travel in China. They're also, I'm not sure if you're aware, but China has officially said that as far as they're concerned, whether you're a Chinese citizen or not, but you're Chinese ethnically, that they consider that they have the ability to detain you. So those of you who are Chinese ethnically, you might want to think about that. But Jeremy seems not to have that problem. But certainly in general, I think people are thinking very hard about whether their executives should travel over there freely or not.
Ironically, the Chinese too, they have a red flag. They said, be careful, do not go to the United States because of all the shootings, you could come back dead. So they think coming to the United States is a very dangerous place.
Don't stay away from high school,
It's on the
church, and
watch
synagogue,
list.
and you'll be fine.
Now, Carlos's second question was, who are the allies of China today?
Pakistan is the only ally China has, and then they have like their little kind of misbehaving brother, North Korea, that is sort of like an ally, but not really. I mean, they wouldn't ever do anything for China. But I mean, Pakistan is the only all-weather friend China has, and in fact, the government has stated that they do not want to live in a world of alliances. And it's unclear if this is just, if this is something that won't last if they actually start to develop their own allies, if this is just a way of criticizing the United States. But that is something you see in Chinese government rhetoric, that a system of military alliances is not good.
But if you use a different definition, I think China clearly is trying to step into the void that the U.S. is leaving. So wherever the U.S. is stepping back, they're trying to at least step forward a little bit. The other is, the Belt and Road, initiative, the investments in Africa.
If you broaden it beyond alliance,
that's a different story where they're clearly trying to have influence.
and I think they're doing very well in much of the developing world, and Europe too. I mean, Xi Jinping is in Greece, is just leaving right now, and having a wonderful schmooze fest with the Greek president, and who's been praising Belt and Road,
and they're about to have the RCEP and the AIB and a lot of
Italy
alliances.
and so forth.
So, I mean, you can see economic, I guess, groupings, and I suppose you could call them friendships, but only one alliance.
Yeah. There was another second question?
Yeah, it's just a clarification. So earlier you said kind of 3 themes: poverty alleviation, urbanization, and I didn't catch the third one.
Oh, yes. National security. So that's the reason why they're going after making sure that the Uyghurs are in check. And it's so curious to me that there's not a single Chinese person I know to this day who think that the way they're handling it is wrong. Because they say at the end of the day, who has more deaths and who has more terrorist attacks, the US or China. They say, you have all these shootings, we have nobody died from gunshots, and everybody's safe. So that's their metric.
And do people feel they're making progress on the first two? So the third one, clearly people
Yes,
are
the
interested.
poverty alleviation I mentioned, the urbanization, now they're up to about 65%. They want to get to, US is about 75-80%, and that is really one of their main things. They're trying to build another 100 cities over the next 10 years, 10 million people going to creating more like suburbs each year. And so there's this huge plan that they're, with environmentalists and et cetera, to how to create cities and how to move people from peasant-like situations.
Yeah, I mean, these are astonishing numbers.
Huge numbers.
A city with 10 million people is a big city,
Yeah.
right? And if you're creating a whole bunch of them, it's pretty interesting. Now, let's take our first online question.
What do you expect to be the impact of tariff surcharges on U.S. companies in terms of vendor negotiations / passing on tariff surcharges to U.S. consumers?
I don't know if I really have the authority to answer that question.
As I said earlier, this last phase of the tariffs really hurts the US much more than before. And it doesn't impact China as much because it's manufactured outside, assembled, and sold outside China. And
Well-
so, and then it's finally, even though we don't see it yet, it's basically the US consumers that get hurt the most.
Yeah, because the tariffs are paid by the importers, right?
Importers, and it gets
And
passed
it
on.
might be the Home Depots or whoever, right, that brings the product in. And then they're facing a dilemma, which is, do you pass it on to the customer or not? And these decisions are being made all across this country in terms of what to do. I think a lot of companies are choosing not to pass on. It's very difficult to raise price significantly, right? And of that magnitude. So a lot of them are only partially passing it on, but it is a challenge. At the end of the day, two people end up paying it. Either the company, the importing company, absorbs that tariff, or the consumer, and the consumer being the U.S. consumer.
So the last round of the tariffs really affected apparel much more. This last round is more electric and electronic appliances. So it's
And furniture.
and a little bit.
Yeah, and so forth. Any other questions from either online or in person? Yes, go ahead.
You mentioned that the Chinese can't afford a Tiananmen Square incident in Hong Kong, but will they just let this continue for months and months and months?
Well, I think they will let it fester rather than actually roll the tax in, because that would be, I mean, if they had to, they would do that rather than back down. But that would definitely be the last option, because I mean, it would be the end of Hong Kong as an open financial center. And then where would you launder your ill-gotten gains? So I don't think the government is, they don't want that. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm being a little flip. That is one of the reasons why they don't want Hong Kong
By the way,
to end.
Jeremy's style is one of the reasons why his podcasts are he's very subdued, he's very careful about the language, extremely considerate.
At least he didn't curse today.
So forth. So, no, I've listened to many of Jeremy's podcasts. First of all, they're excellent, and they generally interview an expert in different areas. But also, they're really a lot of fun to listen to.
Well, I just want to make a comment on that. When they had the umbrella revolution the year before, the Chinese government felt that they should have ended that much sooner, that because they didn't do it, so this happened. Had they ended it much sooner, they could have contained this much sooner. But now things have just gone on for so long that they feel that if they came in with tanks, Merkel has gone there and advised them not to. Almost every global leader has advised Xi Jinping that it would not, the whole world is watching him. Having said that, there are initiatives. Housing, in Singapore, public housing is 70% of their housing. In Hong Kong, it's only 40%, so they want to increase that, and they have already started to build homes outside of the Lantau area. And the other thing is vocational training. They want to provide vocational training, especially in the tech area. But we don't know how.
But I don't think that,
Yeah.
those things, I mean,
So
it's too
Jeremy
late, too
doesn't
little,
agree.
too late.
That's how Jeremy
I mean,
thinks.
yeah, I just don't, I don't think I think there's a significant
Right.
group of youngsters who are way past that, way past that.
Okay, so he doesn't agree, but
But I mean, I don't think that those things are going to mean suddenly people are like, oh, I'm not going to go protest next
right,
week.
well, they
because
want
I-
democracy, so that they're not going to get.
In the meantime, by the way, I'm sure you're shocked to know that the billionaires in Hong Kong are moving their money out. I know it's a big surprise to you. They've been
Well, they
opening up
have.
accounts and moving them
Yeah.
because the rules still allow them to move a fair amount of currency, which is, of course, not making the Chinese government happy, but they can't stop all of it. Any other questions? Maybe one last question? Okay.
Well, I'll monopolize. Demographically, what's the outlook for China?
Old before rich. Old before rich.
Old people.
Yeah, I mean, it's happening now. You know, we're sort of crossed through now where the population is, you know, I'm blanking on the numbers, but we're basically at a point now where it's going to, there are more old people and the labor force is smaller than the number of people who are going to depend on them. We're kind of getting there right now.
So
So,
like Japan?
yeah,
Exactly.
But much poorer.
But on an accelerated basis. And also, the Chinese government totally misjudged the following. They had the one-child policy, and they held on to that for a long time. And then they said, okay, we'll ease it up. And so a number of years ago, they stopped that. But they had gone past a certain point where suddenly the mentality of the young people was, I don't want to give up a lifestyle. And if I have children, now I've got to spend my money on the children. I'd rather not have children and live a good life. So the birth rate is still extremely low. So it's a tragic situation from a workforce point of view, right? Because the speed with which they're becoming elder is very dramatic. So this is a problem that's going to be a big problem, fairly soon, right? Right?
Yeah, so there are 34 million excessive male versus female, and now they're allowed to have 2 children, but nobody wants to have children, 2 children. They only have.
I mean, I think it is already a problem
It is
that
a
you've seen. Labor is no longer cheap in China. I mean, the supply of poor young people is exhausted.
Yeah.
So,
Will that have any other impact on racial issues? On politics, on control, on, how does that play out?
They're pushing AI, so they have more robots to take care of, their AI nurses take care of the elderly.
yeah, that is a fascinating question. I don't have a good answer for you.
But you might be able to get one yourself as you get older, but you have to learn how to speak Chinese. So I will tell you, it doesn't surprise me that this year's panel on China was as interesting, I think, as helpful to the audience as last year. So I do not regret the decision to inviting the two of you back.
And
Well,
if
thank
I
you,
may-
that's very kind.
Thank you, Peter. I just want to say that on November 21, we have our signature conference called the Next China Conference. It will be held at the Appella Conference. I know many of you are out-of-towners, but you're welcome to join us. Please go on our website, www.supchina.com. SupChina is not subterranean, but What's Up China, SUPChina.com, and you can find the ad for Next China Conference, and we welcome you all.
But I strongly encourage you because they're a wealth of knowledge across the board. So whether you have a corporate issue that you got to deal with, or you just want a report on what's happening, so forth, obviously they're in an unusual position to have insights that are, shall we say, very different in a very positive way versus what you're going to get just by reading or calling up the traditional Chinese experts, right? So thank you. Join me in thanking. So with that, Dewey, are you ready? Are you ready? Yeah. He's very subdued, he's very careful about what aggregates, extremely conservative.
At least he didn't curse today.
So forth. So, no, I've listened to many of Jeremy's podcasts. First of all, they're excellent, and they generally interview an expert in different areas. But also, they're really a lot of fun to listen to.
Well, I just want to make a comment on that. When they had the umbrella revolution the year before, the Chinese government felt that they should have ended that much sooner, that because they didn't do it, so this happened. Had they ended it much sooner, they could have contained this much sooner. But now things have just gone on for so long that they feel that if they came in with tanks, Merkel has gone there and advised them not to. Almost every global leader has advised Xi Jinping that it would not, the whole world is watching him. Having said that, there are initiatives. Housing, in Singapore, public housing is 70% of their housing, and Hong Kong is only 40%, so they want to increase that, and they have already started to build homes outside of the Lantan area. And the other thing is vocational training. They want to provide vocational training, especially in the tech area. But we don't know how.
But I don't think that those things. I mean, it's too late, too little, too late. I mean, I just don't. I don't think I think there's a significant group of youngsters who are way past that, way past that.
Okay, so he doesn't agree, but.
I don't think that those things are going to mean suddenly people are like, oh, I'm not going to go protest next week.
Well, they want democracy, so that they're not going to get.
In the meantime, by the way, I'm sure you're shocked to know that the billionaires in Hong Kong are moving their money out. I know it's a big surprise to you. They've been opening up accounts and moving them because the rules still allow them to move a fair amount of currency, which is, of course, not making the Chinese government happy, but they can't stop all of it. Any other questions? Maybe one last question? Okay.
Well, demographically, what's the outlook for China?
Old before rich. Old before rich.
Old people.
Yeah, I mean, it's happening now. We're sort of crossed through now where the population is, I'm blanking on the numbers, but we're basically at a point now where it's going to, there are more old people and the labor force is smaller than the number of people who are going to depend on them. We're kind of getting there right now. So
like Japan?
Yeah.
Exactly.
But much poorer.
But on an accelerated basis. And also, the Chinese government totally misjudged the following. They had the one-child policy, and they held on to that for a long time. And then they said, okay, we'll ease it up. And so a number of years ago, they stopped that. But they had gone past a certain point where suddenly the mentality of the young people was, I don't want to give up a lifestyle. And if I have children, now I've got to spend my money on the children. I'd rather not have children and live a good life. So the birth rate is still extremely low. So it's a tragic situation from a workforce point of view, right? Because the speed with which they're becoming elder is very dramatic. So this is a problem that's going to be a big problem, fairly soon, right?
Yeah, so there are 34 million excessive male versus female, and now they're allowed to have 2 children, but nobody wants to have children, 2 children. You only have,
I mean, I think it is already a problem that you've seen. Labor is no longer cheap in China. The supply of poor young people is exhausted. So,
will that have any other impact on trade issues? On politics, on control, how does that play out?
they're pushing AI, so they have more robots to take care of, their AI nurses take care of the elderly.
Yeah, that is a fascinating question. I don't have a good answer for you.
But you might be able to get one yourself as you get older, but you have to learn how to speak Chinese. So I will tell you, it doesn't surprise me that this year's panel on China was as interesting, I think, as helpful to the audience as last year. So I do not regret the decision to inviting the two of you back.
And
Well,
if
thank
I
you,
may-
that's very kind.
Thank you, Peter. I just want to say that on November 21, we have our signature conference called the Next China Conference. It will be held at the Pella Conference. I know many of you are out-of-towners, but you're welcome to join us. Please go on our website, www.supchina.com. SupChina is not subterranean, but What's Up China, SUPChina.com, and you can find the ad for Next China Conference, and we welcome you all.
But I strongly encourage you
Participate.
because they're a wealth of knowledge across the board. So whether you have a corporate issue that you got to deal with, or you just want a report on what's happening, so forth, obviously they're in an unusual position to have insights that are, shall we say, very different in a very positive way versus what you're going to get just by reading or, calling up the traditional Chinese, experts, right? So thank you. Join me in thanking